Hello everybody, my name is Ryan with Alder Branch Homestead, and today we're going to be looking at a quick and easy way to make coasters. Circle coasters, square coasters, all that kind of good stuff. Coasters that look like this. So, you don't need any super expensive tools, you don't need a clicker press, you don't need dies, any of that kind of stuff. And if you want to know the exact tools that I'm using, they're in the description of this video. They're Amazon affiliate links, so it doesn't cost you anything extra, but if you use those links, I might get a small commission, all that kind of good stuff. And without further ado, let's get into it. So these are the kind of coasters that we're going to be making today. Got some square ones, some round ones, we've got plain, and we've got stamped. First things first, you need some leather. I do, of course, love making these out of this chrome tan leather because once you cut it out, you're done. But since I'm going to show some of the carving, like on this one, we're going to do this out of veg tan leather. Another note, I'm going to show you ways to make this a lot easier even if you don't have a clicker press, but I do highly recommend you try this out on a thinner piece of leather first. So how are we going to get a perfectly square coaster like this without a clicker press? Well, the answer is we're going to use a template. And templates can be hard to find, they can be expensive, but these quilting rulers come in square, they come in a bunch of different sizes, and they're marked on them, so we can use them for all sorts of stuff. In fact, if you really wanted to, you don't even have to use a square one and cut it to square. You could even just mark it out and cut along if you wanted to. So you could actually get two out of this one if you wanted to. But that's not what we're going to do today because it is a lot more fun to just cut straight around our template. So try to do it somewhat close to the edge so you're not wasting a bunch of material. But it is as simple as holding the ruler down and making 4 cuts. And the hardest thing about that was cutting around the camera. So it is just that simple. And hear you now. Cutting out a square, not that complicated. Yeah, using a template makes it easier, but I'm sure you could have figured that out. And, you know, the idea of using a rectangle, moving your ruler around, all that kind of stuff. But how do I cut out a circle? And how can I get even close to what a clicker die is going to get me? Now, yes, you could, you know, with a thick coaster like this, you could use that as a guide. You could use whatever else that's a circle as a guide. You can take your little slices around. You could sand that smooth, but that's going to take a while. That's a pain. That's annoying. I don't want to do it like that. And I want something at least somewhat repeatable. And the answer is this circle cutter. Now, there's a bunch of circle cutters out there, but what's interesting about this one is that it has a rubber pad at the bottom of it. Now, most circle cutters do not have a rubber pad. They have a pin. Now, a pin is very good if you want to get a scrap piece of leather, make a circle, because that circle cutter is not going anywhere. That is actually my table racking as I try to slide this cutter on the piece of leather. But here is our problem. We now have a pin mark in our leather. Now, that's not the biggest deal. You know, it does make our cutting a little bit easier, but it does mean that we either have to live with that pinhole, if we can get the pad back on this cutter, or we have to find some way of covering it up. Now, on this chrome tan leather, there is no way to cover it up, and I don't think anybody's going to believe you that a pinhole in the center of your coaster is just part of the rustic appeal of your pull-up leather. I don't think anybody's going to buy that. I certainly wouldn't buy it either. So, let's say you want to go that route, but you don't want it to look so obvious. You can always make it part of your pattern. Plenty of patterns are right in the middle of your leather. So you could use a stamp. I don't know how you can see that. If I hold it the other direction, that's still not that good. Let me just stamp one here. You can use a stamp that comes to a point. Now, this leather isn't cased, so these aren't going to be super deep, but you can just set the point of your stamp in the center. You could do just one. That could look good. You could do a whole bunch of them. Let's see how 2 looks kind of nice. We could, it's a little bit harder to find where you started. Let's do 4 and see how that looks. You could take your time and make sure these are all perfectly laid out. You could mark them out. You could even go a step farther and do 8. That's starting to look interesting, though suspect. Depending on what the rest of your pattern is, that could be very suspicious, but nonetheless, it certainly looks better than a pinhole in the center of your coaster. Now here along comes this guy with its pad. Now what's the downside of this? Well, when I stick this on my leather and try to move it around, it hangs on some. You see the table moving a little bit, but it does want to slide along. So this does not grip nearly as well as that pin. Now you could change this. You could swap that pad out. You could put some other sort of grippy material on there. You could use double-sided tape or whatever you wanted to do, but as is, it's workable, but that's something to keep in mind, and it definitely makes a big difference as you get up to these thicker leathers, right? This is just 7-ounce leather, and it can be a little bit tricky to cut that, but doable. So if you give this a try, I highly recommend you try it on a thin piece of leather to start, at least for 1 or 2, if you have the luxury of having some thinner leather around, some scraps, whatever it is. First, before you try to cut some nice thick tooling leather. And the other thing is that you want to make sure that the blade is the right depth. So I don't know how you can see that, hopefully pretty well. You just adjust this, or loosen this screw, and you want that blade to be sticking out just past the leather. And keep in mind, if you go the wrong direction first, when you're cutting your leather, that blade is going to wiggle, and if it wiggles, double check it's in the right spot. You also want to adjust the size of your circle. So you just adjust this center screw here, and there is a template that it comes with, but it's in metric, so I don't know what that really means relative to anything, because I don't think in metric. So that's something to keep in mind. But honestly, the whole point for me with using a tool like this, aside from getting a nice smooth circle, is that I'm going to get a set in the same size. I'm not worried about getting exactly a 4-inch circle on this, or a 3.8-inch circle, or whatever size circle you want. I'm worried about the set being the same size when you stack up a whole bunch of them. Of course, I think all of these are random sizes. That's all I really care about. So, and this does that perfectly. So, let's see what it looks like in action. Now, keep in mind that the white part is not the size that you're cutting, it's where your blade is, and it can be a little bit hard to visualize, so give yourself a decent margin of error. And also, I do like cutting on these self-healing mats. However, for something like this, I actually kind of like these punching mats a little bit better. They seem to not grab the blade quite so much when I'm using the cutter. So, another thing to, another warning is that there is an arrow for the cut direction. But if you are goofy like me and don't pay attention to that when you put your blade in, your blade might be pointing the other direction. So this doesn't really matter which direction it's going, just remember which way your blade is going. Because like I said a second ago, if you go the wrong direction, it is going to twist your blade and you will need to reset that depth. All right, so with all that out of the way, we're going to place it, let's say right there. Press it down firmly to start, then hold on to the center and just twist the cutter around your circle. You'll feel it break free as you go around the first time, but just for good luck, you can always go around a couple more. And there we are, our perfect circle coaster. So with that, we now have some plain coasters. Now, what do we do if we want to take these to the next level? Now, we could obviously dye these. That could be cool. Make them whatever color you want. You could mix dyes together, get some crazy cool custom color. But I think what we're going to do is we are going to do a little bit of tooling. And tooling always looks good if you have a border. So we are going to put in a border. And just in case we wanted to add some stitching or something like that, I'm going to set this well wider than I would normally stitch. So I normally stitch at about 5 millimeters in. So I'm going to go 10 millimeters in. And I will also warn you, cutting in this circular border is a little on the tricky side. So if you don't have experience doing tooling and cutting straight lines, and especially a circle, definitely do some practice ones first. It's a little bit hairy. I don't know if you can tell how uneven that is or isn't, but hey, I'll show you how that works nonetheless. So all you have to do is just take your divider and run it around your edge, and this is indeed the easy part of this. Oop. And there we have that marked in. I don't know how well you can see it, but there is a faint mark there. So for the square, it's a little bit easier. Well, a little bit easier, a little bit harder. So be careful on the corners. And you don't actually want to go absolutely to the corner, closer than I'm doing right now, but you obviously don't want to mark past where your line is, like that. I don't know how you can see that. You want to avoid doing that. Not the biggest deal, but you want to mark almost to the corner, but just leave a little bit of a gap. Hopefully you guys can see that on here. But I'm just leaving the smallest little gap I can in the corner there. And there's all that marked. Now we need to cut in our border line. So I'll be right back, and I'll have this leather all cased up. Now I've got my leather cased. This one I think is pretty good. This one I think is almost there. And what that means is I've just wet this leather down and I've let the moisture kind of redistribute in the leather. So when you're carving leather, you want it kind of at just the right moisture content. So sometimes that means letting it dry for a minute. Sometimes that means adding a little bit more water. But it's unfortunately kind of a feel thing. You gotta figure out what works best for you. If your impressions are too light, you want to add a little bit more water. If they're too dark or your swivel knife is dragging, you want potentially a little bit less water. Actually, your swivel knife can dig in or drag a little bit kind of both ways, but sort of judging based on the impressions you're getting, you kind of need to feel that out and get a feel for it. So with that, the only thing that we're going to cut out is just the border on these. And this is much harder than it looks. And so I highly recommend before you go in and do a piece like a piece that you want it to be a finished piece, give a practice on like a scrap piece. Of course, I wasn't thinking about demoing this one, but to demo it in a piece that's too dry, you're just going to be dragging that in and making some nice straight lines like that, just with the blade tipped. Let's see if I can demo this so my arm's out of the way, left-handed. Just dragging the tool along like that. Just going to sort of quickly go through this right now. Maybe down the road I'll make a little bit more detailed tutorial on using a swivel knife. But gist of it is, keep it at an angle and make sure that your leather is at the right case. And just go for it. And you don't need to bear down on this super heavy, but you do want to get a decent bit of depth out of your cut. Another trick is that you want to be moving your arm, not your hand, while you're doing this. So I'm kind of pulling my elbow backwards is what I'm thinking about as I'm moving my swivel knife. And you want to come really close, just like when you're marking to the corner. Woo. But not quite all the way to that point. I also recommend not doing what I was just doing there and trying to touch it up. Try to make it all in one go. And that's all you need for the square. Now the circle is much harder, and we'll see how bad I goofed that up. Another thing to note is this leather is not that thick, so be careful. You don't want to go all the way through your leather when you're doing this. But the circle, you are definitely going to want to practice first. In fact, I'm a little in disbelief right now that I haven't messed this one up yet. And, well, there, of course, I go off course right as I'm saying that. And part of the trick is to turn the work as well as the knife as you do it. Now, a little wonky, but it is what it is. And we can smooth that out a little bit when we bevel our edges. But like I said, this is very tricky work and definitely something to consider, but I'd be careful. And hey, practice makes perfect. Definitely start with the straight edges. So from here, what do we want to do? Let's do just a border on this guy. And let's do a geometric pattern on this one. Probably the same one as before. So let's do a tri-basket weave on this guy. And then just the pointed crescent or whatever that's called on the edge of this one. But before we do that, we need to bevel our edge a little bit to get that a little bit more distinct. You don't have to do that, but it does give it a little bit more of a 3D effect. Now, one thing that you could do is you could use this, which is called a push beveler, and just go along your edges like this. I'm pushing really gently right now. And that's another thing that I would recommend. As you're learning to carve, it's much better to go very gentle the first time, and then come back darker a couple times if need be, then go really hard. That's how you end up with a super janky look. Now, if you start with a janky look like that one, well, that is what it is. But nonetheless, jokes aside, just a little bit harder and a little bit harder. But what we really want to do, and what most people are probably going to have, is, if I can find the right size here, just use a regular, here we go, beveler. And this is an extra steep beveler. I like that one a little bit better, but any beveler will work. And actually, let me get a lighter maul real quick. This one is, I think, about a pound, whereas this one's 1.5 pounds, which is super overkill. Well, for this thickness level, but also for a beveler like this. And all you want to do is just gently work along your edges. And I'm just barely tapping this guy. All right, now that we're around the whole edge, just kind of give a once over to see if there's any lumps or bumps or anything too out of the ordinary there. And what I really like about this is that two things. One is it gives a nice firm spot for us to register our camouflage against, or our geometric fill that we're going to use as a border on that one. But another thing is, if you don't do that, you get a really sharp edge on the bottom of your border, which you can look fine, but by doing that, it really has this sort of doming out effect on the edge. And I think that looks really cool and really makes it feel like it's, well, 3D, which, again, it is literally 3D, but it really makes it pop against this border. So that's a really cool effect, and that's why we did that. But because of that, you don't need to have this absolutely perfect, because this is going to get stamped over. So now that we have that in, we're going to move to our geometric stamp. And this is a tri-basket weave, and this could be any stamp. You could use a basket weave or whatever you want to do. Here's another one that you could use. This is a tri-hex geometric stamp, I think it's called. You can use whatever you want, and you can get really fancy and lay this out, but hey, I want this to be a nice, easy project. I don't want to do a bunch of layout. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to stick one stamp right in the middle, and actually I'm going to move to my heavier mallet here and call that good enough. And then I'm going to carefully line up another one and just march across my panel, or in this case my coaster, until I get close enough to the edge. It's maybe a half-ish stamp from the edge. And then I'm just going to work along kind of in lines, filling up my coaster. And this is going to curl a little bit. If you wanted to stop that, and it's actually going to stretch out ever so slightly. If you wanted to stop that, you could just tape the back of this with like painter's tape. But hey, let's make this easy and fun and quick, and let's not worry about it. We can always flatten it out. It's veg tan leather. I can just... It's wet already. I can just flatten that back out. That's not a big deal. Now that I've got roughly one row in, I can lay in my next row. And like I said, this is thin leather, so don't try to pound the hell out of it, getting super dark and deep impressions in your leather. But it can still take a decent impression. Like I did that one backwards. Okay, that's fine. Not backwards, twisted slightly, but that's okay. Let's see, how do we fix that? That's should have been like that. That's all right. what I get for yapping as I'm trying to lay all these in. All right, now that we've got that done, first of all, can you tell which one I did yapping away under a camera? Well, happens to the best of us. What are you going to do? Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to lay in our border. And you can use a camouflage, you could use a border stamp, whatever you want. I'm going to use a border stamp. Or border stamp. I'm not going to use a border stamp. I'm going to use a camouflage. And this one's a little bit big, but what are you going to do? And you can, for the corners, you can either lay one in diagonal like this, or you can just let them overlap, leave a gap, whatever you want. But I'm going to leave mine diagonal. And now all I got to do is march across here. But the trick is, it's kind of like stitching. You might not have the perfect number of stamps as you go across. And also, you don't want the gap to be right in the corner. So what I do is, you can just very faintly do some test stamps and see where you're going to be at. And it looks like we are going to have a little bit of a gap there. And I find that if I leave a little bit of a gap, it's a little less noticeable than any of the variants that I have than if I try to leave no gap. So I think we're going to squeeze 3 more here. And there we are as one side. There goes a bunch of pens off my desk. Shook the table too much when I was showing how much the cutter can slide. One more side done. One left to go. And I don't know if you can tell too well while I'm doing this. I do have my camouflage at just a little bit of an angle here. All right, that's the camouflage around the edge. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to fill in this little bit of a void here by laying in a few more stamps and tipping it away from the edge and just rolling it over until we get just enough of an imprint. You don't want them to butt right up against the camouflage, but you just want to give a little bit more continuation of the pattern. Just like that. All right, and there we are. Actually, right here, I think I'm going to lay in a little bit more. Just real light. All right, and there we are. And as I always say, don't talk while you're working it. It comes out a little bit better. Can you tell which one I did when I was talking and which one I did when I wasn't? But nonetheless, still look good. Also, side note, trying to not hit the camera with this, but there's actually ridges in this maul, and just the ever so slight resting against this put those little marks. So don't do that. Now we just need to come through, and of course I bumped that too. This is going good. All right. Now all we need to do is go around the edge of this one with our beveler again. And this is the exact same thing as the last time, just in a big circle instead of a straight line. All right. So here we are. Now, we just need to grab our border stamp. Here we are, we have our border stamp, and this is a pointed crescent, I believe it's called. It looks like that, and looks pretty cool. I like it. I think this is also, I think they actually sell this as a geometric stamp. So we could have actually just punched along here. It almost has kind of a, not quite scaly look, but kind of like that. But I like it. It's pretty cool. So all we do is, just like our camouflage stamp, is we just line this up in the groove and stamp that in. Way too hard for the first one. That almost punched through. And unlike the camouflage, because we're not trying to blend into anything, we have plenty of space, I'm going to tip that forward a little bit. So I'm going to register it in the edge and that little lip that we've created. I'm going to get it one tap, and then I'm going to lean it forward so I can get the point of our stamp in there. And like I said before, just leave a little bit of a gap in between them, because that lets us adjust our spacing as we come to the end without looking nearly so obvious. If you have no space between them and then you need to adjust it and just a random couple have space, it looks a little worse than, well, that one's maybe a little narrower than that one, but you're really not going to tell unless somebody is sitting there with their nose 2 inches from your coasters. And unless they're a leather worker, I kind of doubt they're going to be inspecting them quite that closely. So there are stamps going around, and in just a minute or two, we can get these all punched out. And now that we're to the end, we just want to eyeball how much we may need to adjust those stamps. And it looks like, yes, we just need to add just a little bit more space around them. And there we are, our border stamped around our circle coaster. And the nice thing about that is those marred parts aside, we were able to at least hide any major goof ups that we had around the edge of this. So if somebody looks really close or gets out some calipers to measure your coasters, you're going to be in trouble. But short of that, it's not too bad. So get these out of the way before I dump them on the ground. There are our coasters. So if you have any questions, definitely let me know in the comments. If you have any other comments, let me know in the comments. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.